Welcome to today's Lunch and Learn webinar, Exemption Certificate Best Practices Reducing Audit Risk, brought to you by ArcherPoint and Avalara. Tight crackdowns by state governments have included greater attention to non-tax transaction compliance as they increase sales tax compliance audits. It's important to be able to produce to the auditor a valid current exemption certificate and evidence of its appropriate association with the right transactions. Oftentimes, businesses have a manual process for tracking customer exemption certificates that can increase errors and audit risk. Our presenter today is Christine Martin, tax specialist for Avalara. Christine has extensive background in tax, working for over 25 years in corporate tax roles. In today's webinar, Christine will discuss how automating the exemption certificate lifecycle within your Microsoft Dynamics NAV system can save you time and money, as well as improve your staff and customer experiences with non-tax transaction compliance. We'll have a Q&A at the end of today's session, so please either type your questions in the questions pane of your GoToWebinar console or use the raise your hand option to ask your question verbally. I will announce the person asking the question and unmute your line at that time. Let's go ahead and get started. Christine, over to you.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. We just went through some housekeeping notes, but I'll touch on them again. Everybody's phone lines have been muted. If you've got questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A box. You can toggle between full screen mode and the control panel view by using the floating toolbar in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. And at the end, if you've got any questions, your phone will be unmuted. So let's get started. What are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about what are exemption certificates and why bother with them, the collection of certificates, validation of those certificates, maintenance of the certificates, some other considerations, and automation. So first, why bother? Well, an exemption certificate is basically a document that proves that an otherwise taxable transaction shouldn't have had tax charged because you have a piece of paper from your customer explaining why they shouldn't be charged tax. There's hundreds of documents across the country that can be used as an exemption certificate. The state of New York has over 20 different exemption certificates. There's a certificate for contractors. There's a certificate for exempt organizations. So basically, if you're selling a product that's taxable to a customer and that customer says, don't charge me tax, you're required to get a certificate and have that on file, so if an auditor looks at your sales and wonders why you didn't charge tax on that taxable item, you have backup with your customer's signature verifying why they shouldn't have been charged tax. So why should you bother gathering these exemption certificates? Well, statutorily, a sale is taxable unless you get that exemption certificate. Technically, if you don't get an exemption certificate from your customer, you should be charging tax to that customer. Again, why bother? Well, financially, sales tax auditors can come in and they can look at those exempt sales, and if you don't have backup for those exempt sales, they can actually assess you for all of those sales that you don't have backup, and that could be a pretty penny if you think about them doing a sample. And of the 100% of exemption certificates that are exempt sales that you had, 10% of them did not have exemption certificates. They can actually take that 10% error factor and extrapolate it across the entire audit period. So it could be a big financial burden on your company just for missing a couple exemption certificates. The customer service side of exemption certificates. If you've got a poor process and you're asking your customers for an exemption certificate every time they come in and buy something from you, eventually they may get tired and go to somebody else who doesn't ask for them at all. Make sure that you've got some efficient processes in place that really alleviates the burden of collecting those certificates, managing those certificates, and makes it efficient to deal with your customers as well. Exempt sales today, what we've seen is that it's a repeated poor customer experience. I'm sure many of you have had to deal with issuing an invoice to a customer that has tax on it. A couple weeks later, they send you an exemption certificate. You have to credit that invoice put in the exemption, reissue that invoice with no tax on it. So it takes time for your customers to fill out that paperwork. Sometimes they don't even know what certificate they should give you. You may have to tell them that you're not going to give them a refund of that tax yet because you've already paid it, that you want to wait to get the money back from the state before you give them money. Or even you put orders on hold until you get an exemption certificate from a customer. A suboptimal exempt sales processes, certificates are not electronically stored. Paperwork gets lost. Customers get discounts that equal the tax. Lost sales because somebody doesn't want to fill out an exemption certificate. And sometimes you just don't have people that know what is a good certificate. So several years ago we took on a project and a customer gave us boxes of exemption certificates to scan and map and validate and put into their system. And what we found is they had been taking copies of driver's licenses, copies of social security cards, business licenses. There was all kinds of stuff in there, but they really weren't valid exemption certificates. But they'd been toting them around for 10 or 15 years. So this took up time, it took up space. Thankfully, an auditor never asked to see any of those. So what's a typical exemption certificate management experience? Well, it's burdensome and it's audit prone. Customers have invalid certificates. They're not signed, they're not dated, they don't have an ID number on them, and customers just disappear sometimes. So an auditor comes in and asks for a certificate. You may not be able to find them to get that certificate, and then what do you do? A lot of companies don't have a process for reviewing the validity of a certificate. And it's hard to go through and track certificates when they expire and the requests that have been sent out. If you're in multiple states, it's really tough to manage which states certificates expire and when they expire. Even within the state of New York, the 20 different certificates that are out there, one certificate may have an expiration period different than the other. So having that blanket statement that New York certificates never expire may not be accurate. You could have billing errors that are due to inaccurate data. You could put in an exemption certificate number into your ERP and exempt tax for a customer, even though what they gave you wasn't an exemption certificate. Or in a case of Florida, where the Florida exemption certificates expire every year on December 31st, you've put in an exemption number for your customer. Come January 3rd, they buy something else. They haven't given you a 2013 exemption certificate, but you never took that number out of your ERP, and you've still exempted them for their 2013 sales, even though they don't have a certificate on file for you. Many companies that don't have an exemption certificate solution or process really lack the reports to be able to quantify their exposure or do any analysis around those exemption certificates. One of the things that I had to do at a paper manufacturer that I worked for, because we were publicly traded, was we had to put on our books what our exposure was if an auditor came in today and found all of those sales that were flagged as exempt that we didn't have certificates on file for. And it's really a daunting task to be able to find a certificate and provide them to an auditor. When I worked at Marriott, we had exemption certificates, but they were all on file in the customer folio at the hotel. And by the time an auditor came in, it was 3 or 4 years later, and what we found was in many instances, those certificates were actually thrown away. I was also a tax manager at a telecom company in Virginia, and we had a room full of exemption certificates. And it was like breaking into a cold sweat when I had to go into that room to find the needle in a haystack. Most times I just picked up the phone and called the customer and asked him to send me another one. So what we've seen is recurring audit assessments. Auditors come out and they know that exemption certificates are easy pickings for them. They can come out and look at all of your sales that were tax exempt and go through and pick customers that they want to see certificates for. And a lot of times, because they're out looking at these same customers over and over again, They know which ones don't provide accurate certificates. So on the financial side, there's the sales and use tax audits. So what we've seen is disallowed exempt sales are typically one of the leading causes of audit assessments, and they make up about 35% of audit liabilities. And as I said before, these auditors can take that error factor of missing exemption certificates and extrapolate it across the entire audit period, which really causes an issue. More on the financial side for you guys, a lot of times people won't send out orders until they get an exemption certificate on file. So holding up those orders means holding up revenue for you guys. But then also you've got the issue of issuing tax credits to customers and then rebilling them. So it takes longer to get them to pay a bill. Then you've got the intangible side of things. Customer service. Having inexperienced people calling to get certificates when there's an audit. Customers aren't being billed correctly. There's the redundant requests for documents. One of our customers a few years ago was actually asking for a new exemption certificate with every single sale that they made, and their customers just weren't happy with them because they had to provide the same thing every single time. You want to be able to increase your efficiencies. You may find that people are short paying their invoices for that tax amount, and then somebody in the credit department has to go through and make the phone call and find out why the invoice was short paid, and it turns out it was short paid because of tax, and then you've got more time spent trying to get that exemption certificate rather than getting it up front. The amount of time that you're going to spend doing credit invoices because you got an exemption certificate after an invoice was already issued and tax was on it. Storing those exemption certificates in a central location in a way that you can easily get them when an auditor asks for them. Or be able to filter through those exemption certificates and know which ones are going to expire. And then you've got Sarbanes-Oxley. You've got to be able at any point in time identify your risk and quantify your risk and be able to accrue for it. So what are the challenges? We've asked a number of people what the challenges are for managing exemption certificates. And what we found is that 80% of people said the collection of those exemption certificates is the hardest thing. Next hardest thing is managing those expiration periods. And then it drops off quite a bit down to managing the customer taxability. But just the sheer collection of those certificates, you look at some folks that go through and do mail merges and send those out to all of their customers. And then somebody has to manage who's responded with an exemption certificate, who hasn't, and then again send out a second request. And all of that work is done manually. So let's talk about the collection of exemption certificates. We've talked to a number of people and we've asked who's responsible in your department for collecting these exemption certificates. And what we found is typically it's the credit department that's responsible for collecting them. We've also found that the credit department is the one responsible for updating the customer records within the ERP. Sometimes the tax department never sees those exemption certificates until an auditor comes in the door, which at that point they may have been exempt incorrectly for a number of years. So individual requests versus bulk requests. Within the Avalara solution, you've got the ability to send out a request to a customer one at a time. If they've got a new shipping location that's already an existing customer, you can send out that request just to that one customer. You've also got large collection campaigns. Let's say you're going through an audit in the state of Georgia and you know that you're missing some exemption certificates. You want the ability to be able to send out a request to a number of customers all at once. Or better yet, if you've acquired a company or you were acquired, you changed your name, All of those things may require that you go out and get a number of exemption certificates from a number of people. These large collection campaigns, when you have a bulk number of certificates that you need, there's a whole process that you go through, identifying who those customers are and where they are, starting that campaign and figuring out how you're going to do it. Are you going to call them all? Are you going to do a mailing campaign? Are you going to send out faxes? Do you even have the emails to be able to send them emails? Then you've got the task of being able to track all of those that are undeliverable. Which ones came back in the mail? How do you know the faxes that didn't go through? What do you do with those emails that have bounced? Then again, you've got to track those responses, making sure you know which customers you've received certificates from so you don't go out and send them second and third requests. You've got to have folks that can answer questions. You've got those folks that never respond, and what do you do with those? And then escalating reminders for those folks that don't respond at all. You might want to make the language in their communication a little bit stronger. This is my third request and I haven't received a response from you. If I don't hear from you by May 1st, you're going to become taxable. So how can you go about getting these exemption certificates? Well, you can do this manually, which is what we find with folks that don't know that there's an exemption certificate solution out there for them. They do mail merges. They use spreadsheets to track which certificate requests have been sent out, which ones have come in. Certificates are hit or miss where you can find them. Sometimes they're in a bottom left-hand drawer. There's sometimes an awful lot of invalid certificates that come in, but the people that are managing this process don't know what makes up a good certificate. It's very time-consuming and it lacks control. You've got the option for technology, using a web-based software as a service. It improves your workflow. It reduces your staffing by 80%. It reduces the skill set that's needed by your employees. And it gives you accessibility to all of those certificates and reports. You can even take this software and integrate with your ERP so that the taxability flags for customers are turned on and off based on when certificates expire. And you don't have to remember to turn off those Florida certificates. The system can do that automatically by knowing if you've got a replacement certificate for 2013. Or you can outsource the function altogether. You can use a company like Avalara that has a defined process. It takes the burden away from you, the labor burden away from you, the knowledge burden away from you, but it is expensive. So let's talk about the validation of exemption certificates. What makes a certificate valid? Well, it's got to be fully completed. Some folks think that it just needs a state ID. Others think it just needs an exemption number. So what makes a certificate valid? Well, at a minimum, it needs the name of the buyer and the name of the seller. It needs the buyer's permit number or why they don't need one. In Texas, wholesalers aren't required to register, so they don't necessarily need to provide a permit number. It's got to have a description of what's being purchased, what type of business the purchaser is in. It's got to be signed and it has to be dated. That date is what starts that effective period. If it's not dated, how do you know when it expires? Some additional validation considerations. The type of exemption. Is it on the right form? There's a multi-jurisdiction exemption certificate that allows multiple states to be used for an exemption, but there's actually 3 pages of footnotes because each state has different requirements on when they can use that form. Is it filled out completely? Is it good? Have you taken it in good faith? If a farmer comes into Office Depot buying paper and he gives an exemption certificate saying it's a sale for resale, somebody really needs to question, is the farmer reselling paper? So what about the maintenance of these certificates? You need to have a centralized place to gather these certificates, a place that you can go and find those certificates if you need them for an audit, or if a customer has a question about an exemption certificate. I taught a class yesterday, and one of the things that we were talking about was exemption certificates. There were 3 people from the same company there, and I asked him how they stored those exemption certificates. And he said, well, by customer and by state. And I said, well, what if it's a multi-jurisdiction certificate? Oh, well, we store the multi-jurisdiction certificates separately by customer number. So in this case, if you're looking by customer number in a specific state, how do you know to look for that exemption for that customer in the multi-jurisdiction binder? And they all 3 kind of looked at each other and realized that they really don't have a good process for storing those certificates. Are they being stored in binders, in the customer master files, in dedicated filing cabinets? Again, we had binders of certificates when I was with the telephone company, and they were in a room that was fairly large. That they were on shelves on 3 walls of this room. And again, it was like finding a needle in a haystack because everybody that came in organized them a little bit differently. Or you can store them electronically. You can scan certificates and map them to a network drive. You can have a company-wide image management system. That's actually got to be maintained internally. Or you can have tax-specific management application that's got a built-in workflow. So capturing data from exemption certificates, what's the minimum amount of information that you need? Well, you need the issue date, the expiration date, and a form name. You need the customer account name, the account number, and the state that it's for. Even if you've got a certificate that you know is wrong, it's best to keep it because sometimes you may have an auditor that's feeling lucky and he's feeling nice and he may allow that certificate even though it's not dated or they didn't put in their ID number. When you receive an updated exemption certificate, make sure you keep the older one for historical data. The one that you have today for 2013 in Florida doesn't necessarily suffice for 2010, but you need to keep that 2010 one on file because maybe they haven't audited you for that period yet. The ongoing maintenance, expiration periods, what a daunting task. Those certificates can expire anywhere from 1 year to 10 years, and it may not even be a full year. You can get a Florida certificate from a customer on December 1st, and it expires at the end of that month. You've got to have a way to check when those certificates expire and to override those without really pestering a customer. For certificates that never ever expire, I always suggest to people that make them expire every 4 years and go out and get new ones. If your name has changed, if your customer's name has changed, technically those certificates that were originally issued don't apply anymore. The same customer that gave us boxes of exemption certificates, one of the certificates that we found was a 4x6 card, and it was dated 1960 something. It was in fabulous shape, and we asked them if we could keep it because it didn't apply to them anymore because it was 3 names prior to where they were today. And it was just amazing that they had kept this certificate around for 30, 40 years. Exemption certificates for ongoing customer expansion. As your customers branch out to new locations or new ship-tos, you've got to be able to capture that information and get new exemption certificates. If you're going in to do drop shipments for exemptions are extremely difficult. Some states allow you to use your home state exemption certificate as proof of an exemption in another state. Mergers and acquisitions, the expansion of your company, really plays a factor into exemption certificates as well. Again, if you've acquired a company and you're changing its name, all of those certificates that were originally issued to them no longer apply and you need to go out and get new ones. So let's talk about some other considerations of exemption certificates. Well, billing integration. You need to have a system that can track which customers have exemption certificates. You want that billing integration to also change that exempt flag back to taxable when that certificate expires. Likewise, you want that integration to change the customer to exempt when you have a new certificate on file for a specific state. So the best practice is to always charge tax to your customers if you don't have a valid exemption certificate on hand. That will reduce your exposure under audit. Technically, you don't have to issue a credit to your customers for sales tax if they didn't give you an exemption certificate when the invoice was originally issued. You can tell them to go back to the state and get a refund from the state, but most companies don't do that just for customer relationships. They'll go through and issue that credit back to that customer. We've got a white paper that's available on exemption certificate processes and billing integrations if you'd like to see it. Exemption certificate and customer service. Again, charge tax to your customers even though they've submitted a certificate. Customer short pay invoices, you've got the time to reconcile the discrepancy. Sometimes people don't even notice that short pay is for tax for a long time. There's some customers, like the government, that don't like to pay invoices until everything is resolved on that invoice. So again, you're reducing how much money is coming in your door. We've got some customers that I've seen that don't tax even though there's no certificate that's on file. When an auditor comes in and asks a question, then they start trying to track down that customer, or they may bill the tax later on. I spoke with a customer, a prospect, probably a month or so ago, and they didn't have a sales tax solution, but they needed exemption certificates because everything that they did was sale for resale. And apparently they were sending out these letters to their customers saying, hey, we need your exemption certificate. If we don't get one, we're going to charge you tax. And it would get stronger and stronger with each letter, and by that third one they would say, you know, I need to get this exemption certificate or I'm going to start charging you tax. But really they never charged them tax because they didn't have any mechanism to charge tax to their customers. So if a customer never gave them an exemption certificate, they were still exempt. Not a great practice by any means. What are the benefits of having an exemption certificate management process? Well, it's going to reduce your risk of audits. You're going to have the taxability of customers turned on and off based on the certificates that they have in the system. It's going to make you more efficient, and your internal resources are going to be able to do other things than track exemption certificates and send out mailing campaigns. It's going to be less repetitive, and you'll spend less time managing those audits. I used to spend weeks trying to find exemption certificates for audits. If I would have had a solution like this, or even one that was available back then, I would have been able to go to our exemption certificate solution, put in a customer number, and print out that certificate or save it, saving me an awful lot of time. You're going to improve your customer relationships. You're going to be proactive in dealing with these taxability issues. So again, back to efficiency, you're not going to have to issue credit memos and then reissue invoices without tax. You'll be able to resolve issues quickly with customers, take action quickly on those certificates as well. So how do you sell an exemption certificate management solution to the bosses inside? Well, focus on the benefits that we've talked about. Map out the life of an exemption certificate at your company right now. Identify who your stakeholders are and involve other departments. We've seen an awful lot of times where the tax department really wants an exemption certificate solution, but they really don't understand what happens before it even gets to them. So take the time to map out that process and look at all of those departments that are affected and everybody that has their hands in that exemption certificate process. Involve all of those people in this decision-making process so that you've got buy-in from all of the departments. Use concrete examples. Give specific situations of customers that were really ticked off because you've asked them for the same certificate 30 times. Give specific examples about the audit assessments that you've paid because you've missed exemption certificates. Look at the number of credit and rebills that you've done that relates to exemption certificates that were received after the fact and how much time your team spent on that. Or look at the number of orders that are on hold because you're waiting a tax resolution, an exemption certificate, etc. Or do an analysis that would show if an auditor came in today and I was missing all of these certificates, here's what it could cost us. Again, if you're a public company, show that you've got this requirement to have a reserve that is booked on your books for potential audit exposure for those missing exemptions. If you've got a solution in place, you'll know at any point in time which certificates aren't on file and what your exposure is. So you may be able to change the look of your financial statements just by changing that reserve. So automating this exemption certificate process. Avalara has what we call AvaTax Certs, and it's actually quite easy. It allows you to look up valid certificates. You can send certificate requests to your customers directly from customer cards in your ERP or from the AvaTax Certs solution itself. Customers have the availability to go onto a wizard, answer a couple questions, get to the right form that requires them to fill it out completely, and they use their mouse and sign it. So just by using this wizard and the AvaTax Certs solution, it ensures you that you're going to have a valid certificate that has all of the required information. So from the AvaTax Certs solution, you can send off requests directly from your ERP. Again, customers can electronically submit their certificates, and again, they use their mouse and sign it. And then you can transfer this information from the exemption certificate solution over to your tax calculation module as well. So then it turns those taxability flags on and off based on certificate information that's in the system. So what are the benefits of AvaTax Certs? Well, first, it automates the certificate collection process. So again, you can send these requests directly from your ERP. You don't have to do a mail merge and send them out. It tracks automatically the expiration of those exemption certificates and all of those requests that you've sent out to customers. You're eliminating those lost certificates because they're all stored internally in one system. You're eliminating your audit exposure for exempted transactions that you don't have an exemption certificate for. Because you've linked it with the exemption certificate and the calculation module, those two things work hand in hand to change the taxability of customers. It's going to enhance your customer service process because once they get those exemption certificates to you, the transactions can be processed. They've got an easy way to get you the right form, and you're not having to go back to them and say, no, that was your business license, no, that was a driver's license. You send them to the wizard, and you get the right form. Again, you can integrate AvaTax Certs with your ERP right out of the box, and it fits any size business. We've got small customers that use the exemption certificate solution, but then we have companies like Apple and McKesson that use the exact same exemption certificate solution. So what's it look like? Here's a screenshot of our request screen within AvaTax Certs. You can send out this request by email, mail, or fax. You can send it to one customer. And you've even got the ability to preview this request before you send it. If you pull up the customer within the AvaTax Certs solution and there is no email address, it obviously won't allow you to send an email to that customer. So if you sent an email to a customer, we've got standard letter templates that you can use, but you can also create your own letter templates similar to creating a mail merge. If you've got an auditor that's coming in, you can create a letter template just for that. And you can include in this email a link to the website. So the customer actually clicks on that link and it takes them to the wizard where they can submit that request to you and use their mouse to sign it. All of the requests that are sent out are tracked. So here you can see we know who sent out the request, that they logged into the wizard using that tracking ID that was sent to them. They started the wizard, and then they created the exemption certificates. So here you can actually click on certificate and view a copy of that certificate that the customer submitted electronically. You've got the ability to get down to the exact certificates that you're looking for. So if you want to look at those certificates that are going to expire within a certain time frame, you can put in expiration parameters and run those reports. Once you get to those certificates that you're looking for, you can print each one individually, or you can check all, and then from here you can bulk print them, or you can save them in bulk to your network and then email them off to an auditor. For all of those certificates that you've got stored in-house right now, you do have the ability to upload those to the system, and then you just have to go through the process of associating those certificates to a customer, a state, and an expiration period. A quick look at our wizard. The wizard is actually branded to you. It has your logo on it, your name on it. And the first page basically says, here's what we're going to do. Many of you may have actually received these from some of your vendors. The customer then is taken to the next screen where some of their information is already populated. They do have to enter in what their business description is, what it is that they're purchasing from you as well. From there, they're asked a series of questions. First one, well, why are you exempt? And in this case, we said that we're for resale. So you're going to resell this. How are you going to resell it? Are you going to resell it as is? Are you going to resell it for some other reason? Or are you going to include it with something else? So after they've entered their ID number, we know which form that they need. The customer uses their mouse. They sign the certificate, and they submit it to you electronically. So really, you can start using AvaTax Certs in just a few hours. It can be a standalone solution, or you can take the solution and marry it up with your ERP as well. We've got different varieties, if you will, of our AvaTax Cert solution. We've got an integration with POS. We've got an integration with e-commerce. So if you've got an e-commerce store, as customers go into the shopping cart, you can put a checkbox in that says, I'm tax exempt, which would then take them to a wizard. They can complete the certificate, sign it, submit it, go back to the shopping cart, and finish their shopping cart experience with you. Then you always have an exemption certificate on file associated with that transaction. You can integrate the exemption certificate solution with your back office systems. And then we've got professional services that can help you as well. A number of our customers don't want to take the time or don't have the time to load their legacy certificates, so they actually look at Avalara to help them with that as well. Our professional services team goes out to companies and does training on exemption certificates and how to use the exemption certificate solution. And they also help with nexus studies, taxability studies, and audit defense. A little bit about Avalara. We've received a number of awards over the years, including 2010's Microsoft Partner of the Year. We were named one of Seattle's 100 best companies to work for. We are SSA 16 certified, and we are a SST certified service provider. On our website, we've got a number of demos. So I'll stay on this page for just a second. You can copy down that URL. Feel free to go out to this website. Look at the demonstrations that we've got out there, the videos that we have out there on the various solutions that we have. So the elements of an end-to-end compliance solution: AvaTax Calc, which does your address validation. It assigns jurisdiction. It assigns the product taxability. It assigns the sourcing, and it's available for reporting. The certificates piece goes hand in hand with that, and the AvaTax Certs solution can integrate with your calculation solution as well. It gives you the ability to send out requests, a wizard for your customers to create those certificates electronically, gives you a place to store those certificates for easy retrieval, and it's a way to help you renew those exemption certificates as well. And lastly, AvaTax returns. For those folks that use the tax calculation module, they'll be able to log on to their admin console, review the liability worksheet, approve that liability worksheet. Once the returns have been approved, Avalara prepares those returns. They file the returns and pay the returns. And then at the end of the month, we provide a copy of all of those returns that we filed on your behalf, including electronically filed returns. Any notices that you get, we ask that you email them to us. We'll log them in our proprietary notice log, but give you access to a notice log where you can see the status of those notices and any comments and notes on what we've done to resolve those notices. I'd like to open up the floor if anybody has any questions at this point.
All right, thanks so much, Christine. Again, if you would use the questions pane in your GoToWebinar console to type any questions, or use the raise your hand feature if you'd like to ask a question verbally. We'll give everybody just a few moments. Okay, I do have a question here. Idea of cost for this product. Christine? I guess maybe ballpark. I don't know if it's based on...
The cost, there is an activation fee associated with the Certs solution. And then basically you're buying blocks of exemption certificates that are being stored. And actually, if you send an email off to cdm@avalara.com, we can have somebody contact you regarding what those blocks are. They don't let me in on that information.
And then Wolfgang wanted to know if Avalara connects with Navision. I believe the answer is yes.
Absolutely, it is.
API. Let's see if we have any others. I had a question, and I've forgotten it. Yeah, I guess my question was, at what point does it make sense to have a solution like this? I mean, is there a kind of a threshold, if you will, of number of exemption certificates that a company is managing where it really makes sense to outsource the management and tracking of exemptions?
Great question. I mean, obviously with 20, 30 certificates, you can pretty much manage those on your own. When you get into the hundreds of certificates and you're getting into multiple states, that's when you really need to look at something that can help you manage those certificates and their expiration periods and to be able to get new ones. So if you're acquiring a company, get something in place and be prepared to get out there and get new certificates from your customers.
And then Denise wanted to know that how many clients we have that are integrating Avalara with Navision, and how long does the implementation take? So I know we have customers that are using Avalara and Navision. I'm not sure how many are actually using the AvaTax Certs.
That I don't know off the top of my head. I don't know. We have a number that integrate with Navision. How many they are, I don't know. And what was the second part of that question?
How long the implementation takes?
That really depends on what you're trying to get to. So is implementation complete when the solution is available for you to send out requests, or is the implementation complete when you've loaded all of your legacy certificates into the system? Basically, if you sign up today, you can have the system available ready for you tomorrow to begin loading customers and sending out requests. It takes a little bit longer to load those legacy certificates, not a tremendous amount of time by any means. We did a project a couple years ago, and I actually helped out with it, and I was able to load 1,000 legacy certificates in a day. So it doesn't take much effort. Just in all honesty, it's kind of boring.
And Eric, I'm going to reach out to you directly after the fact. He said this email to CDM is bouncing, so we will reach out to you. So we'll make sure we report that. And okay. Does Avalara provide sales tax service to Canada and Mexico?
To Canada, yes. Mexico doesn't have a sales tax.
See, she is an expert, guys. I did not know that. All right. I think that's it for our questions. I do want to mention to everybody on the call today that Avalara is actually hosting a webinar next week, May 2nd, 1 week from today. It's 5 ways online sales tax affects every business. There's new legislation expected to pass here fairly soon, so this is pretty timely. If you're interested in that, go to ArcherPoint.com, select the Events tab, and look for the next Avalara webinar next week on May 2nd. Yes, Denise, we will send out a recording of this webinar, and if you'd like the PowerPoint, I'm sure that AvaTax or Avalara would be happy to share that as well. So make sure to email that to you separately. I want to thank everybody for setting aside their time today. I hope you found it time well spent. To help us continue to offer value, we'd like to ask you to take a few minutes more to give us your feedback and share what topics you'd like for us to cover in future webinars. Simply email your comments to info@archerpoint.com. Again, I thank everyone for their time, and this concludes today's session. Thanks so much, Christine. Appreciate your presentation.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye-bye.